My name is John Pfeffer. I'd like to welcome you to a very exciting event about the Philippines and the recent elections there. I work with Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies here in Washington, D.C. We're a progressive think tank, and we've done quite a lot of work on the Philippines in the past, especially my colleagues John Cavanagh and San-Ho Tree, looking at questions of economic globalization and drug policy. And of course, at Foreign Policy in Focus, we have had columnist Walden Bello providing numerous commentaries about the situation in the Philippines and global economy more generally over the years. Today, we're going to have, as I said, a discussion about the aftermath of the elections in the Philippines, probably some information about the lead up to that election as well, what we should expect in the future. I'm very happy to introduce Patrick Peralta. He's been an intern with us for the last several months. He's written a couple of excellent pieces about the Philippines leading up to the election. And Patrick is going to introduce the panelists and give you a little bit more information about the format for this event. And take it away, Patrick. Thank you for organizing this event.
All right, thank you so much, John. And thank you to everyone for joining and to all our panelists, especially to those in the Philippines. I know it's midnight right now, and so it's not the easiest time to be tuning in for a webinar, especially for a topic this difficult to discuss. But before I start, I just want to give a brief thank you to our sponsors, the Institute for Policy Studies and Foreign Policy in Focus, for organizing and promoting this webinar, and also to our other sponsors, the New York Southeast Asia Network, the Weatherhead East Asia Institute at Columbia University, the Philippine Studies Initiative at NYU, the Philippine Global Studies Forum, and the Center for Southeast Asia Studies at UC Berkeley. So just as a little bit of structure for today, I'll be doing a moderated discussion with our four panelists for around 40 minutes. And to the audience, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A chat. If it's relevant to the discussion, I might bring it in. But for the most part, I'll put it into our 20 minutes of Q&A towards the end of the panel. So let's get started and introduce our four panelists. So first we have Vicente Rafael, who is Professor of History and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. He is the author of numerous books, acclaimed books as well, on Philippine history.
Patrick, it seems your audio has gone out. I don't know what happened. You're on mute.
Oh, looks like I was muted. So Professor Rafael, sorry about that, is author of numerous books on Philippine history, politics, and society, including Motherless Tongues, The Promise of the Foreign, White Love and Other Events in Filipino History, Contracting Colonialism, and most recently, and I have the copy right here, The Sovereign Trickster, which is a great book and look into President Duterte's presidency. Next, we have Cleve Argelis, who is lecturer at the Department of Political Science and Development Studies at De La Salle University. He's also head of research at WR Numa Research and PhD candidate in the Department of Political and Social Change at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. His research examines contemporary challenges to liberal democracies in Southeast Asia, including democratic decline, disinformation, and populism. Next, we have Lian Buan, who is a reporter of Rappler, the Philippine media organization founded by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Ressa, and she covers justice, corruption, and impunity. She is also director of the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines and the host, writer, and producer of Rappler's legal podcast, Law of Duterte Land. During the 2022 presidential election, she covered the campaign of Bongbong Marcos Jr. And finally, we have Cristina Palabay, who is the Secretary General of Karapatan, a national alliance of human rights organizations and advocates working for the promotion and protection of human rights in the Philippines. As Karapatan's spokesperson, she leads its lobbying efforts for laws against torture and enforced disappearances and for the protection of human rights defenders and indemnification of victims during Marcos's martial law. In 2021, Christina was a recipient of the Franco-German Prize for Human Rights and the Rule of Law. All right, so just to begin, President Marcos is taking office on June 30th, which in the Philippines is tomorrow. And I know the big question on everyone's mind is, what does this new administration of Bongbong Marcos as president and Sara Duterte as vice president look like? But I think I would also be remiss in not mentioning that the beginning of a new administration is at the same time the end of another one, namely that of President Duterte. So I'm curious to know, as President Duterte leaves office, what are some of his legacies that he leaves behind? And in a decade, when we look back at his presidency, is he just a footnote in history, or is he actually one of the most memorable presidents we've had in Philippine history? And I'll turn to you first, Professor Rafael, because you actually write about this in your book, The Sovereign Trickster, where you examine President Duterte, the way he governs, and a lot of the legacies that we are now left to wrestle with.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this webinar and for setting all this up. And it's really a delight to meet my fellow panelists, who I'm sure have a lot to contribute to this discussion. I mean, the question of Duterte's legacy is something that a lot of people have been parsing recently, and I think it's very important to reckon with his administration and the things that he leaves behind, and how much of this will carry forward in the new administration. I think with Duterte, I mean, usually when we evaluate or when we reckon with a prior administration, the people usually say, well, it's a mixed bag, just good things, bad things. With Duterte, my sense is that the let's just say the malevolent tends to overshadow the benevolent. It is not to say that there were certain things that happened in this administration that wasn't, beneficial, but many of these beneficial developments were carried over from the prior administration of Pinoy Aquino. I think he'll be remembered most for his nefarious drug war, the number of killings, extrajudicial killings that emerged from this drug war. And of course, the drug war is one in a series of many other wars that the Philippines have witnessed. I mean, in my own reading, the drug war should be situated within a long history of counterinsurgency in the Philippines and political violence that was propagated by, among other things, the police, the military, and various other armed forces of the state. And this drug war is certainly something that will be remembered by Duterte. My sense is this drug war has resulted in, from the point of view, at least my impression from the point of view of the people in those communities, they claim that the drug war has helped secure a sense of peace or a sense of sort of stability, but one that is driven by fear. It has definitely not ended the problem of drugs as Duterte had promised he would do it. If anything, what it's done is it's spurred, as I said, the notion that in areas where there is this insecure sense of criminality, that only sort of strong extrajudicial solutions are possible. I think one of the things that Duterte leaves behind is the normalization of this notion of extrajudicial solutions, quote unquote solutions, which, as I said, are not really solutions. This notion of extrajudicial solutions, including, of course, mass killings, as the most effective way of dealing with this kind of crisis. And it's going to be interesting to see how much of this normalization, as I said, carries over into the new administration. So I'll stop there and let others contribute, because I'm sure many others have other things to say about this.
Thank you, Professor Rafael, for spotlighting that focus on the drug war in the administration. Hinay, Leon, Cleve, do you have any other thoughts on what kind of legacies President Duterte will leave as he departs public life?
Yeah, I can contribute as well. Um, I think it's important context as well that when we talk about the legacies of the outgoing president, that he will be exiting power. He will be exiting the presidency as one of the most popular Filipino presidents, um, especially in the 1987 in the 1987 Constitution. Despite the erosion and the attacks of democracy and human rights in the country and how he left Filipinos on their own during the pandemic, he will end this term with this much support from the Filipinos. And because of that, I also think that one of the key legacies, aside from what Professor Rafael already mentioned, one of the key legacies of Duterte is also how he was able to influence a shift in public attitudes on some of the key enduring issues around democracy, questions on human rights, for example. We've already since 1987. It's we There were already attempts to kind of undermine what was a product of the fall of the martial law, sort of like this very temporary kind of like convenient consensus around the democratization project. There's been constant attempts to undermine that, but I think what Duterte did is really try to crystallize and try and successfully shifted public attitudes towards a direction against, for example, the project of democratization as well as human rights. And I think this will be really one of his enduring legacies, and one that many academics, human rights advocates in the civil society will have to confront moving forward. Um, so, for example, if you see how it, part of it is definitely a trolling and disinformation, but also how you see the behavior of Filipinos online in terms of like how they view human rights, for example, and how human rights has become a really partisan project from the perspective of some of the Filipino population. This is a very dangerous development in terms of the public attitudes, for example, on human rights. The other thing I think, and I think this is also quite related to where the conversation is headed to. I think the way that he raised the curtains for the Marcoses is also one of his enduring, what will be his enduring legacies, and also a very insidious legacy at that. It wasn't really much about these elections. I think he played a role um, years before this election. So he didn't have to give the endorsement to Marcos Jr. To his candidacy, right? Because since 2016, since he assumed the presidency, we have seen how he has mobilized state resources to repudiate the memories of the EDSA people power, as well as rehabilitate the image of the Marcos family. There were, public instances of him talking about the rule of Ferdinand Marcos and the supposed lasting achievements of the dictatorship. So I think this is, as I've said, this is shaping up to be one of his insidious legacies, that he was able to resurrect and kind of also infuse fresh energies to what was then something that was already discarded and rejected by the Filipino people.
Patrick, everyone, thank you. Well, uh, from the perspective of human rights advocates like myself, I think it's it's a very common view among many of us who look at the Duterte regime as something that has a legacy of impunity. And this impunity is not just, attributed to a single campaign like the drug war. What Professor Rafael described, the is essentially like a shrinking of the space, the small space that we have, of exercising exercising our rights. I mean, the basic right to life, that's what was violated through and through. You know? The next is the right to due process, the right to freedom to express, press freedom, association, the right to political dissent. All these things are not just one-off things, no? As we look at the discourse of human rights, all of these are interconnected, interdependent, no? And one right, is very much related to one other thing. No? At the same time, we are very concerned that since the start of the Duterte presidency, of how the concept of human rights was seemingly not only distorted but mangled towards the end, because as what Cleve said, there are various distortions there. There's this binary between human rights and human life, you know, and how these concepts are being pitted against each other. At the same time, the concept of sovereignty as to in relation to international human rights obligations, was being put out there. I mean, I think this is not unique to Duterte's uh, um, language or policies are concerned. No, this is somewhat an expression also of a global phenomenon. But at the same time, the same old, counterinsurgency issues or the specter of public order and safety, how this can be maintained. These are all issues that has been used, to weaponize the law, to weaponize social media, to weaponize practically all the spaces that we have, against the people, against those, especially the poor. I cannot underscore how this has impacted the poorer sectors of society. I mean, Lian and I and perhaps Cleve were here. We can use the internet, speak our minds out, and of course we face various risks, but nothing, I think, beats the risks of those in the community, especially in the urban poor communities and those in the provinces, because of the militarized solutions to everything. I mean, the answer to anything is the kill, kill, kill policy. We did not coin that, but it has been repeatedly used by this president. So we call it impunity because practically no one has been made accountable. No one responsible up in this chain of command has been responsible. Only the small ones. Even the chief of police in Caloocan was not made accountable for the lapses in the case of Kian de los Santos. So what more in the other cases? In the many other cases that have been that were not put out there through CCTVs. So definitely he has a legacy, a bloody legacy of impunity.
It's hard to follow all of that. But I'll say this. I think President Duterte would be leaving with the judiciary in question. He's the first president after the dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. to have won almost all of his interest cases in the Supreme Court. We've never seen that post EDSA. During the time of Arroyo, his appointees were deciding cases against her. Justice Carpio even wrote the ponente that thumbed down the attempt to change the charter to extend her term. Even during President Aquino, the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional some parts of the DAP, which was really a big blow to the administration. But in the Duterte government, he won everything. He won everything. He's the first president post EDSA to have done that. Even the trial courts and the appellate courts have been put under siege. You have a judge who had acquitted an activist and was red tagged days after. If a judge cannot freely render a decision without having to see her name red tagged on a flyover in EDSA, then what kind of free judiciary that would be. And there have been 66 lawyers killed in 6 years alone, and that's more than all of the lawyers killed since Marcos combined. And some people would want to be careful about framing the 66 lawyers because they don't want to make it seem like martial law was not that bad. They don't want to make it seem like we had that martial law was better, or that in some ways it was a good thing. But there is this number that 66 is more than from Marcos to Aquino combined. And so that really put a lot of pressure on lawyers. You have local police surveying courts on who are the lawyers who represent activists or progressives. I mean, that shrunk the space even more. And as a last thing, the drug war and the template of the drug war, which is also being used as a template for the war on activism and the war on progressives, it's all in arbitrary fashion. So you don't go through due process, you just put people on a list, and then people on this list end up killed. And when you ask lawyers or even people inside the justice system, they would say that we had a pretty solid, we have pretty good mechanisms in the justice system that could have and should have protected all these people. But when you have a president in Malacanang who say you can kill and I will protect you, then that is the one word of one man subverting all of these systems and mechanisms. So I would say that the legacy would be that he put the judiciary under question.
Well, thank you all. I think, to sum it up, the Philippines is moving increasingly towards authoritarianism. I think that's the legacy of Duterte: targeted violence, indiscriminate violence, but all in all, a huge growth in political violence and disregard for democracy. And so it's really shocking for a lot of people in the West, maybe still in the Philippines, that the winner of the 2022 election is the son of a dictator. Not only did we have 6 years of President Duterte, the Filipinos want 6 more years of a possible dictatorship, or at least ties to dictatorship. And he's the first majority president since 1981, when his father accumulated all those votes. And so I'm curious, how do you make sense of this historical 180, where in 1986, during the EDSA revolution, people were clamoring in the streets, nuns and civil society groups were banding together, you could confronting tanks, very reminiscent of Tiananmen Square in Beijing. How do we make sense of this historical 180? And Leanne, if I could go to you again, you reported on Senator Marcos as you followed him closely on the campaign trail. What can you tell us about his supporters and also the reasons for supporting him?
Yeah, I would take off from your premise, which is that many people are surprised that 31 million people chose the son of dictator. But I think for me, because I followed his campaign even before the official campaign period, and when he launched his campaign in February, I kind of knew that if there's no change with the way that the other candidates would attack their candidacy and their campaign, that he was going to win. I knew it as early as February, and I knew it even more as we progressed into the campaign period and I met more people. I leave the political analysis to Cleve and Professor Rafael and Tinay, but what I saw during the campaign is that we are coming out of a pandemic. People are hungry, people lost their jobs. Many of the things that should have been, that what we think should be forefront of a campaign discussion doesn't make sense to them. For example, when Senator Lacson talks about bottom-up budgeting, it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. When Vice President Leni Robredo talks about participatory government, it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. What the Marcos campaign did was they figured out, I don't know how they figure it out, but they figured out that Filipinos are wired to turn into something that makes them feel good. So if you're coming out of a pandemic and these things don't matter to you, the economy is sinking, you have lost your jobs, what is the one tangible thing that would make you feel good? It's not all those big words. It's unity. It's the promise that when you elect us, you will be happy and you will feel good because there will be no more bickering. That's the campaign they run on. They said that they were gonna be friends with the opposition, that even though they have been battered for the last 36 years, they would treat these people as friends. So it's this kind of messaging that worked with a lot of people, and that's what the people told me on the ground, is that they just want to stop fighting. They just want to transition into a society where everyone goes along with everybody. And I think that's what a lot of us, me included, realized very late, that it was a powerful message and we made fun of it early on.
I think that's very reminiscent to President Duterte's campaign, where he was running on an emotion, which is law and order, the need for immediate solutions. This is a more tangible, unity, everyone together. But it was also interesting that's similar with President Duterte and now incoming President Marcos, is the role of social media in facilitating mass emotion towards the mobilization of votes. And so I want to ask you, Cleve, because you studied this, this is what a lot of your work focuses on. Can you talk about the role of social media in the 2022 elections, especially as reports have shown the increasing and oftentimes harassing influence of troll armies and bots and the like?
Right. And I'm building on what Lian just said, that because we were also WR Numero, we were also doing polling. We were also doing weekly polling during the election, actually even before the start of the official campaign period. And as what Lian said, we've actually discovered that the majority of the Filipinos, around 55% of the voters, actually decided, were actually already decided on who they will vote for even before the start of the campaign period. So you have most of your voters already decided. And part of the reason, and I say only part because definitely the disinformation explanation, the disinformation narrative is not going to explain this whole phenomenon. It's more complex than that. But that is also a significant part of the story. And I think one of the key evidence for that is that the voters were already decided even before the start of the campaign period, because for the past 6 years, the Marcos disinformation machinery was already put into place. And what happened during the election, when the campaign period started, when the official campaigning really started, was that they were just reaping the benefits of their investment in this massive online disinformation machinery that they have been operating, right? And there are studies, for example, from researchers at the UP Third World Studies Center, showing that the on-the-ground disinformation campaigns in select communities have been in place for far longer. And so what we have observed in the actual campaign period was that the pro-Marcos disinformation campaigns have reached this point that they've already, they were already the dominant voice in social media platforms, especially platforms that are popular to a cross-section of Filipino voters, including, for example, Facebook and YouTube. And these information campaigns, we think at WR Numero, for example, have been very effective, because we've done almost 500 plus interviews among Marcos-Duterte voters around the country. This is aside from the weekly surveys that we were doing for the election. And that, what we've heard from these interviews is that many of the voting considerations of their own voters were significantly shaped by the disinformative narratives that were made popular online by the Marcos disinformation machinery. For example, just imagine voters really being convinced and really proudly saying that the primary reason why they're voting for the Marcos, why they're supporting the Marcos Jr. candidacy is because Lenny, the vice president, is lugaw. I mean, this is really just, a narrative that was made popular online by the Marcos disinformation machinery. But aside from that, other voting considerations were the fact that they think that the Philippine martial law years was the country's golden era, that the Marcos legacy is that of the public infrastructures people supposedly enjoy today. I don't see them in EDSA enjoying any kind of this public infrastructure. And that the plunder of state resources that the dictatorship and their cronies committed is just nothing but a product of yellow propaganda. I think we've one of our other important observations as well was that the Marcos disinformation machinery was also systematically trying to target young voters in several social media platforms, including, for example, TikTok, which is very popular among young people. And they were designed to portray the Marcos family as authentic, hip, and relatable, sort of like political celebrities, while all the while the family's leadership and of some of the country's cases of corruption and human rights abuses were being downplayed. For instance, this was very personally interesting to me. I saw videos. This was recommended to me by a TikTok user, and the videos were showing how Imelda was justifying the use of government resources for her personal excesses, clothes, paintings, etc. Because supposedly this represents the uniquely Filipino philosophy of beauty. And some of the comments were really positive. I think because I'm exposed to the disinformation research, I definitely recognize that some of the comments are just manufactured and automated, but there were also very authentic, organic engagements, and they were very positive in nature. I think I would describe that, as I've said in the beginning, that the role of this information is quite significant, but it isn't the entire story of the Marcos victory.
So it looks like there's violence in President Duterte's presidency. There's the influx of disinformation and lies, and so I mean the future does not look bright for the Philippines in terms of a democratic promise. And so I'm curious if all of you could comment briefly, because you were all part of civil society, academia, human rights organizations, the media. What do you think the future of human rights will look like under this new administration? Have we already gotten indications from the Marcos administration that they will crack down on political dissidents, or is he moving in a different direction from his father and from President Duterte? I'll start with if I can start with Professor Rafael, because just to historicize this moment, is this political violence going to be worse, do you think, or is it how do we understand a new Marcos in power?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Can I just quickly comment on the question of disinformation? Because the way sort of to think about the question of disinformation is that it's part of what Gramsci calls a war of position, right? A war of position where different historical blocks contend for hegemony, and key to that contention, key to that conflict, is the ability to be able to extract the consent of people to join that particular historical bloc. And so really the question of disinformation is always linked to the question of consent, right? And to the extent that that disinformation or misinformation works is to the extent that people consent to the narrative that they're being given. So the question becomes, well, what's the key to that consent? Are people just stupid? Do they just accept everything that's given to them? Or is there something there, as Leon suggested earlier, is there something in the narrative they're receiving that to them appears to be compelling in that particular historical moment, that COVID and sort of the generalized precarity that people live in, that they accept? Because I mean, you could argue that the Lenin-Kiko opposition tried to provide similar narratives of compassion, of care, of participation, and many people responded positively to that. And yet it was the Bongbong Sarah team that managed to edge out Lenny Kiko and sort of revive this idea that somehow they were the better caretaker. I think that's the persistent question that we haven't really answered yet. Like, what is the basis of consent? If you can figure that out, we can figure out the question of popularity. To your other question about and I have some thoughts about that later if you want. To go back to the question that you posed, what is the future of what is it, human rights or violence? Is that what was that the original question? Is that right, Patrick?
Civil society in general, yes. The future of
Yeah.
society actors.
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends what you mean by civil society, because civil society in the Philippines, of course, you have progressives, you have human rights advocates, you have journalists, you have academics, right? But you also have people like Filipino capitalists, businessmen, you have the church, and various other folks. And I think it's split. What can I say? I mean, there's no despite the claims of unification, there's no consensus as to what constitutes civil society and where civil society is heading. I mean, the support for Marcos came not only from the lower classes, it came from the many members of the upper classes who saw BBM and Sarah as sort of people that would protect their interests. For example, clamp down on labor unions, secure judicial decisions that would be sort of favorable to their causes, maintain law and order, especially in the case of Sarah, who people assume would continue the legacy of her father. Secure advantages for wealthy, reopen the whole process of cronyism, maybe expand cronyism to benefit more rich people, contain and dominate not just the judiciary, but the legislature to make sure they pass laws that are favorable to them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a civil society that's pretty split along these different lines. Somebody in the comment section said, one of the lasting legacies of Duterte is to ensure the return of the Marcoses. That is true. And I would extend that to say that he is actually, despite his pronouncements to the contrary in earlier parts of this administration, he has certainly secured the return of the return and expansion of political dynasties. And political dynasties in the Philippines are stronger than ever before. And so in some ways you could say that moving forward, we could look at the BBM Duterte administration as in some ways a continualist, to borrow again that term, continuismo, right? There was no rupture. And simply because I want to suggest this, I don't think people really perceived crisis of authority in the Duterte administration. And so they preferred, at least the majority, the 31 million that voted for Marcos, they preferred a continuation of what they had seen under Duterte. Unlike GMA, for example, Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo during her term, it's clearly a crisis. They voted for Pinoy in 1986 when they overthrew Marcos. Clearly a crisis of authority that ushered in Cory Aquino. I don't think there was a similar sense of crisis of authority under Duterte. They liked that particular kind of leadership, which is obviously why they continue to vote for Marcos. So what this means for things like human rights, for protection of progressive voices and so forth, is obviously bad news. I mean, red tagging will continue, censorship will continue. In a way, it will become even worse, I think. It will, as we've already seen, the way they've been clamping down on certain figures. And again, this is consistent with this idea that if not from Bongbong, at least from those around him, the Justice Department and various other people, that the red tagging will continue, will expand, and there's real fear. I mean, let's not forget, Laila de Lima is still in prison, and God only knows what's going to happen to her. So. I think in terms of human rights, it's going to be bad.
Christina, I believe you also had some comments too.
Well, On the issue of disinformation and how the disinformation machine, you know, uh, chugged on during the election campaigns. I think these kinds of campaigns are also rooted in some objective reality of what the people on the streets. We conducted truth campaigns, no? And in a sense, what people were saying more loudly than many others is that two things now struck us. One, they think that nothing much has changed, hmm, since 1986. I mean, their quality of life, their how they live from day to day. No? And second, how candidates would respond to issues, to gut issues. I mean, human rights is up here. Sometimes we human rights activists forget that civil and political rights are concepts which are felt when your rights are directly violated. No, but day to day, violence comes to ordinary Filipinos, especially to poor communities, because they don't have anything to eat. You know, and they're suffering under during a pandemic in one of the worst unemployment crises in history in the country. So I think this information machine is also dependent on those lived realities, hmm, on of the lives of those majority of the voters. Um, and one thing that that the opposition may look at is how do we address, you know, these issues clearly, and pointedly, in a manner that will truly address these needs, no, immediate and strategic needs of the people. Um, Disinformation will always be there, I think, especially during this time of social media, with all this disinformation um, tools. But at the same time, we should also look at how people are really living from day to day. You know, I mean, they do not just say that we're okay with Marcos, or we're okay with unity. It's also because they received lots of money. Eh. There was really rampant vote buying in the Philippines. They earned 15 to 17,000 in these elections per person. So it's something also. No? It contributed to the concept of that 31 million. So it's whether it's true or not, no? What is clear is that people are grasping at issues or candidates who are addressing these issues. At the same time, what Professor Rafael said on the prospects, I think there are two things lang that indicates the future, no, of human rights in under a Marcos presidency. One is the continuing non-acknowledgement of the crimes committed, the atrocities committed during the Marcos dictatorship. That is a very big indication of where we are going, because it speaks to issues of accountability, and of recognition of whatever is in the law. This is in the law already, the Human Rights Victims Reparations Act. No? And if that is not acknowledged as it is, then um, there are many things that the Marcoses will really do, will seem to be geared at doing, in terms of the structures, the infrastructure of impunity that we were speaking about, how this was maintained since the time of martial law until the present. The second indication are the statements by incoming President Marcos Jr. No, he said that he will not uh, agree to an ICC investigation, no, on the drug war. And the second is that he's keen on continuing the role of the NTF-ELCAC. These are two big issues, no, that affects the exercise of human rights and the protection of civic space in the country. And if he said those during the election campaign period, beware, President Duterte also said many things during his election campaign period. And all those things, he did all those things. So um, with these statements, previous statements of Bongbong, we expect what? A bleaker human rights situation or landscape in the coming months or years.
Thank you, Tinay. So we are running a little close to time, so I do want to incorporate some of the questions that have already come in. And so we have a question from Maria. So she says, for the panelists, would you say that the Duterte regime was able to institutionalize violence, disregard for human rights, and disregard for democracy? So I guess just in other words, what are sort of like the formal mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms that President Duterte has been able to create violence aside from, just his speeches? Lian, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, the drug war will continue. President Marcos has said that he will continue the drug war. The circular of the PNP that was, I mean, the root of all policy, which allowed policemen to neutralize, which to a lot of lawyers meant to kill, is still there. It hasn't been revoked. Much of the legal framework of the drug war that allows policemen to knock on the doors of suspected drug addicts are still there. So yes, for in a lot of ways, President Duterte institutionalized violence, and he enabled or emboldened law enforcement to follow the template wherever they go. So they were able to execute search warrants and then just kill, and then just use the narrative of nanlaban, or fighting back. And we've seen this with the activists who were killed, also in the execution of warrants. And even the obtaining of warrants has also been institutionalized. I mean, you have judges issuing warrants for jurisdictions that are for places that are outside their jurisdictions, and the Supreme Court revoked that power already. But the fact that it went on for so many years, and the fact that it's there, means that it's gonna last for a long time. And also, I wanted to add earlier of how we transitioned to President Marcos, from the POV of someone who works in the business of information flow. President Duterte was really, the information sphere of President Duterte is he just demonizes everyone. He just attacks everyone without regard for any courtesies or pleasantries. And we've had to endure that and confront that and rebuild. What President Marcos will be doing would be a narrative, a strict control of information and narrative. So he will be continuing the feel good information sphere that's all good and shiny and everything like that. And the camp has not changed since the campaign. They keep most of the information secret. Even the meetings with diplomats, or even other meetings wherever he goes, it's not really that open to journalists. So they just release vlogs that are very edited in a fancy way with good music. And when you do discover where he's going or the schedule, there would be a fence so that journalists do not get to see what's really going on. And so you just have to settle for the vlog releases at the end of the day. And that scares me honestly to death, because I don't want to be it's not glossifying what Duterte did, but at least you were there. I mean, there were killings, but you were there on the ground, so you could report whatever you want to see. I don't want I don't want the next 6 years to be just journalists being forced to settle for vlogs that are released at the end of the day, because that's what I think that he's going. And so I think that's really what's the most alarming for me as a journalist, and it should alarm everybody, because, well, at the end of the day, everybody is in the business of truth.
I was just reminded when you were saying how journalists don't really get access to, his travels, how not even 6 days after he won, he was in Australia. And people were defending him going there. And when the vice president was in New York for her daughter's graduation, there were so many attacks against her, even though they were doing the same thing, which is, traveling abroad. So I want to bring in another question from Epi, and this is directed to Cleve and Lian. So she says that there was mention of the tendency of the current Philippine Supreme Court justices to favor the outgoing administration, especially in light of yesterday's decision on the Marcos's DQ cases. How do you see this playing a role in making social media platforms accountable, similar to how other jurisdictions are acting upon the issue by taking social media platforms to court and making them pay damages to victims of cyberbullying, similar to what is currently happening to Maria Ressa? So Cleve, do you want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, I'll just answer this very quickly. So we just organized a webinar at the Australian National University very recently, and I'm going to share some of the findings of Bjorn Dreschel and Christina Bonoan about their study on the emerging factional alliances in the Philippine Supreme Court. And I think this is also building on what Lian said about the behavior of the Duterte appointed justices. So what they did is to look at the past, what they call past mega political cases. So cases involving, constitutional issues, cases involving the interests of the chief executive, the administration, etc. And they found evidence that the Duterte appointed justices have been voting together as a faction as strongly as we haven't seen before. Compared to the Aquino appointed justices, and even compared to the Arroyo appointed justices. For example, and Arroyo, remember, is the longest serving president of the current constitution at 9 years. And another very interesting finding from their study is that they are, since the midterm elections, since 2019, they've also started to observe that the Arroyo appointed justices are starting to also vote with the Duterte appointed justices. So I think in terms of like emerging factional alliances, this is something that we could expect moving forward, that there will be this very strong, tight, solid bloc in the Supreme Court, represented by Duterte and Arroyo appointed justices, voting together and defending in the judiciary the executive interest of Marcos Jr. And definitely that's not good news, in the sense that because they already have the majority control in both houses of the Congress, and for the Supreme Court to also align with the interests of the Marcos Jr. administration, that will just mean that we won't be able to expect any formal institutional checks and balances in this government.
Can I answer the question on social media? I mean, I wouldn't hope too much that we will soon see a kind of a judiciary that tackles social media and how we can make them accountable. I mean, free speech is always a tricky subject to litigate, and that's why much of the rest of the world is having a difficulty confronting this issue. More so than in the Philippines, we're not that sophisticated. Our judiciary has a tendency to go by the books. I mean, we can't even prosecute red tagging. I mean, I know there's no crime criminalizing red tagging, but the group of Tinay and Karapatan has used different framework. We have the international humanitarian law, we have a civil code, we have GRAF, we have other criminal laws that could probably encompass some of the offenses that might have potentially been violated when someone red tags, but still we are not seeing any prosecution for red tagging. I mean, and when we can't even maximize the IHL, when our treatment of human rights cases has always been in the lens of the revised penal code. It's always murder or kidnapping or torture. When we have so many human rights laws enacted post EDSA, like the anti-torture law, but we can't seem to go past what we've been used to, which is the revised penal code and all the other laws. And then we have cybercrime that is very young, and it's a very contested law, and when you see how the Duterte government tried to crack down on the critics during the pandemic, you would see that even law enforcement do not know how to secure a cyber warrant. So I don't think that we should put too much hope, at least in the Philippines, that we would see very soon that we could litigate accountability of social media and disinformation. We're just gonna have to do it ourselves for now, I'm afraid.
So thank you so much. I want to close us out with one more question, sort of looking at what people can do to resist, because I know the for human rights advocates for civil society, it's very bleak. 6 more years of potential authoritarianism, more violence, more disinformation, more lawfare, more court corruption. So there's a question from Efren, and I'll adapt it a bit, asking what can we do to expose the continuing situation of human rights violations under Marcos? And just to expand, what are ways that Filipinos in the Philippines, but also I guess in the diaspora as well, Filipino Americans, other Filipinos, what can they do to resist what might be a disastrous moment for liberal democracy in the Philippines? And T9, Professor Rafael, did you want to share any comments?
Well, I think there's a very broad menu of things that can be done. And one thing that can immediately be done by those in the US would be to band together. I mean, it's we did that, during the election campaign period, and we hope that this can continue. These efforts can continue. Working together, forming various groups, the more the merrier. That's what we learned, during the election campaign period. At the same time, there are also ways by which there's pressure on the U.S. government. Number one, I think there's a pending bill filed by Representative Susan Wild, the Philippine Human Rights Act. It's a bill that asks the U.S. government to either um, reduce military and police aid, to the Philippine government, because this is being used to fund and engender human rights violations of the police and of the military. And that's one thing that those in the US can support, as well as many other initiatives, resolutions on Maria Ressa and on Senator Laila De Lima. Those are things that can be directed to pressure points in the US itself. At the same time, of course, there are many efforts here in the Philippines. I heard of some efforts by those doing archiving work, record keeping work, to help us in under Duterte. That's very important work as well. And of course, do statements, speak out on social media on issues concerning human rights victims, violations victims. Marcos Jr., I think is sensitive to the international communities, more sensitive to the international community's opinions and views. I mean, the way he's acting right now, talking to various members of the diplomatic corps, promising to go to the UN General Assembly in September this year in New York, those are, um, uh, opening salvo niya yun eh, for a diplomatic, for the diplomatic community to give him a red carpet, And I think there needs to be more work, especially by the international community of the Filipino diaspora outside, because when spaces close here in the Philippines, Philippines, we'll never know how it would look like. And so, like during the Marcos dictatorship, the international community's role is much more important during under this administration.
Thank you so much, Tinay. And Professor Rafael, you have the last word. What can we do to resist creeping authoritarianism in the Philippines?
I agree with many of the things that Tina said. I think continued international pressure wherever and whenever it comes. For example, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the continuing ICC investigations and if it spills over into the current administration. So international pressure, the pressure from organized Filipino diaspora voices, I think will be very, very helpful. I think education, I mean, especially from below, if wherever and whenever it's possible, to introduce the question of human rights in our educational system, if that's at all conceivable, especially, I mean, I know it's going to be very difficult because of Sara Duterte's sort of handling, management of that particular department. I think journalists will continue to play an incredibly important role. As Leon had mentioned, so much of our information about what's going on comes from the writings of independent journalists to counter the vloggers that seem to be dominating the flow of information. And academics, I mean, I had to make a pitch for my own profession, who I think it's incumbent upon them to look at this particular moment, as Cleve has shown, and other people have shown, to look at this particular moment of transition, to historicize it and to situate it within the context of the longer sort of view of Philippine political history. So these are all sorts of resistances that we can do. We haven't talked about the Philippine left, and it'd be very interesting to see how the Philippine left in all its configurations, because of course the Philippine left is a very complicated formation, and how it's going to respond to the present moment. Is it going to continue with its, there's a part of the Philippine left that is sort of, very much invested in continuing sort of armed struggle. Will they continue in that direction? There's another contingent of the Philippine left that is sort of much more concerned with, pushing for a socialist agenda. I mean, the campaign of Leody de Guzman and Walden Bello, for example, were very important. They didn't get too many votes, but at least they opened up discussions about future directions of the Philippines. How much of that should we push? How much of that can we push? And then there are members of the legislature. I mean, right now the opposition is absolute minority. Risa Hontiveros has been at the forefront, or will be at the forefront, of leading a kind of opposition in the legislature. And there are many others. There are a few others in the lower house that are also in some ways very skeptical and very critical of Marcos. I mean, to what extent can they pool their voices and form a coalition to oppose Duterte? I mean, these are some of the things that we need to pay attention to. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all our panelists, especially those in the Philippines. I know it's 1 a.m., so we'll let you go so you can get some sleep. But best of luck to you as you enter this new administration. And so thank you also again to our IPS team for helping to organize and promote this panel, and to our sponsors as well, and to the audience. Thank you so much for joining. And so this recording will be up on our website for future viewing, or if you want to share with others. All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.